Hello. Hey, I hope that you're all doing well. I just want to briefly discuss special functions with you today. Now, special functions are section 4.3 in our notes, so if you do have your notes with you at home, you can, of course, follow along with me. If you don't, you can just watch this video, and hopefully that will be thorough enough. So there are three types of special functions that we'll discuss today. I just want to say in advance, though, that normally when we discuss a new topic in computer science, I like to talk about not only the how, so how do you do something, but also the why. So why is it so important for us to know something like a loop, a for loop, a while loop? Today, I don't think we're going to really be able to discuss the why portion of special functions, like why would you want to use these? That's something that we will get to eventually, but I think without knowing classes, which is what we'll go on to learn during our next chapter, you're probably just going to be left asking, why is this something that I'd even want to do? Why is this something that's useful in programming and computer science? I promise that we'll get there eventually. As I said, after our next chapter, well, during our next chapter, we'll be using these special functions all the time, and I think you'll quickly then see why they're so powerful and so important. So with that being said, let's jump into our three types of special functions. And the first type of special function is called a function without parameters. So a function without parameters is just that. It's a function that is not passed any parameters. Wow, that's pretty groundbreaking, I know. Let's look at an example. So here I have a function that is called getUser's full name. You can see that this function declaration or signature starts with the typical public static, which we always include with our function declarations. It then has a return type of a string, the name of our function, which is getUser's full name. Here's what's different. I know, again, this is pretty groundbreaking. There aren't any parameters, so we're not passing any sort of values to our function, nothing at all. Now, again, with our current context, what we currently know, there's not probably really any good reason to do this. In fact, some of the things that we're going to do in this function are things that we generally should not do inside of a function, but we're going to just as a way to illustrate how you could write a function without parameters. So let's take a look at the code for this function. The first thing we are doing is declaring a scanner. Now, I said earlier that, well, just a moment ago, that there are some things that we're doing in this function that you generally don't want to do inside of a user-defined function, and this is one of them. We generally do not want to get user input inside of a function. That's usually the whole reason for parameters, which you can see, I guess, a similar type of function down below where we're passing first name, middle name, and last name. That's a more conventional use for a function. That's just not what we're doing here, again, just for illustrative purposes. So here we're declaring a scanner. We're asking the user to enter their first, middle, and last name, reading those values in, and then simply returning a string with those three values concatenated together. So why would you want to do this? Again, well, I said earlier, don't ask why. We'll get there eventually. But this is just an illustration of how you could use a function without parameters. Now, if I wanted to use this function in my main method, if I wanted to call it, I could do so very simply. I'll just say get user full name, users, excuse me, and I could call it. Now, if I was to run it right now, I'm sure you can imagine this would not actually print anything. It would call my function. My function would ask the user to enter their first, middle, and last name, so it would print that. We'd read in those three values, and then we would return a string with those three values. Now, we're not doing anything with that return value. So let's put this function call inside of a print line so that we can actually do something with that return value. So I'm going to run the function or the project, and it does say enter your first, middle, and last name. So I'll do that, Thomas James Swope. Hit enter, and there it is. It just printed the results of my function, Thomas James Swope. So again, this is a function without any parameters. It's really not much different than what we've been doing, except that we're not passing any values. In this case, we're reading values in inside of the function. We'll see later on, once again, once we get to classes, how we would actually use a function like this. All right, so that's our first type of function, pretty exciting. The next type of function is a void function, or a function that doesn't return anything. So in the previous example, we wrote a function where there's nothing going into the function. In this function, a void function, there's basically nothing coming out of our method. So we could give our function values, but we're not going to return anything. And here's an example of a void function. You'll notice once again, we have public static. That's how we always start our functions for the moment. And here's our return type, and this is new. Look at that. Our return type says void. Void is a return type. What is its type? Well, the type of void type is basically nothing. We're returning something. What is that something we're returning? It's basically nothing. So if you have a function whose return type is void, basically what you're saying is this function is just not going to return anything at all. So in this function, you can see in the description, we'll pass a first, middle, and last name, and then we're just simply going to print the full name. So again, don't be confused with the difference, right? Return type or return value is something that you give back from the function, like we're doing right here. I'm returning first name plus middle name plus last name. I'm returning a value. Here in print user's full name, you'll notice we're not returning anything. We're simply printing out a statement. And in fact, if I was to try to return something, so I put return, I don't know, Bob, right? It's going to give me an error message. And why does it give me an error message? It says void methods cannot return a value. So this is a void method. I cannot return a value. Alright, so let's call this function now. How do I call this function? Well, I'll just simply write the name of the function, which is print user's full name, and then I have to pass it three strings. So I'll say, once again, Thomas, James, and Swope. Okay. Alright, now I'm going to call my function. I'll run it once again. I think I'll comment out this first call, and when I run it, you can see it just says, Dear Thomas James Swope. Pretty exciting stuff. Now let me try one thing. This is going to create another error message. Let's say I tried to print my function call. So just like I did above, right here when I called get user's full name, I printed the return value. So I did system.out.println get user's full name. Get user's full name does return a string, so this statement just printed out that string. Now I'm trying to print user's full name, and again you can notice that it gives me an error message. When I click on that error message, what does it say? Well, I don't know. It says remove argument to match print line, change. So it's not very helpful, in my opinion. But what is the problem? Well, I'm trying to print what this function returns. That's what you're doing when you place a function call inside of a print line statement. Now, what does this function return? This function we know is a void function. It doesn't return anything. So we're trying to print nothing. We're trying to print void. I guess that's even, I don't know, it's quite slightly different than nothing. You can't print void, I guess is the point, right? I mean, we could print nothing. I could do system.out.println and just not put anything inside the parentheses. That's perfectly fine. But here I'm trying to actually print a void. I guess a void value. I don't know how to say that well. We're trying to print void. You can't print void. So I have to get rid of that system.out.println. In other words, when you call a void function, you do just that. You call it, you cannot print it because there's nothing to print. So again, that's our second type of special function, a void function. Our third type of special function are overloaded functions. And I don't know what happened to the title there, overloaded function parameters, but I can fix that. But anyway, overloaded functions are multiple functions with the same name, but either different types of parameters or a different amount of parameters. And this, I'd say, of the three special types of function, this is definitely the most interesting. And again, I'll read that just one more time. So we have multiple functions that all have the same name. So they're all the same identifier, but they have either a different type of parameters or a different amount of parameters. So let's look at an example of our special functions or of overloaded functions. So here you can see I have multiple functions all called average. I have 1, 2, 3 functions. They all start with public static. They all happen to have the same return type. and they all have the same name. You'll notice what's different. Well, the first average function is passed two integers. It finds the average of those two integers and then returns that average. The second average function is passed three integer values. Again, it sums those three values and returns their average. The final average function is passed two doubles, and just like the functions above, is simply returning the average of those parameters. So here are three functions. They all have the same name. They differ only in the parameters. So the parameters are either a different amount or a different type. I happen to name my parameters like similarly, right? num1, 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 num2, and so on. You don't have to. If you wanted to name this something altogether different, that would be fine. These are different functions. What does matter is that they have a different amount or different types of parameters. I could write another function, so let me just copy this one. I could overload this function again. So here I've got Command A, Command I just to fix my indenting. You'll notice as soon as I've done that I have an error. Why is that? I've got two functions with basically the same header, the same declaration. Both of them are called average. Both of them have the same amount and the same type of parameters. Can't do that. They're not overloaded. But watch this. I'm going to change them to both chars for some reason. I don't know why you'd want to find the average of two characters, but you could. All right, so again, I'm going to add them, divide it by 2, and that will give me the average of the char. Let me do something here. I'm going to change the return type as well. So I'm going to return a character as well. Now I have to do some explicit typecasting in order to make that work, but that's not a problem. So again, I'll do the division. This is integer division. I'm going to typecast that back to a character, and it will return the character. I guess basically in between the two parameters. All right, so here are four functions now, all with the same name. They differ only in their parameters. How would we call these functions, you may ask? Well, let me again go back up to my main. I'm going to comment out the previous function calls. And I'm going to first system.out.println average, and I'll pass it 3 and 4. Okay, so which function would this call? You can see the name of the function is clearly going to be average. This function call is passing two integer values, 3 and 4. 3 and 4 are both integers. So Java's smart enough to recognize the fact that, look, I've got an average function. It's being passed two integer values. So the compiler or the Java runtime will understand that it should call this average function. And I could run it to illustrate it. You can see it prints 3.5. All right, let's add in a third integer value. So I now have a similar function call, but instead of passing it two integers, I'm going to pass it 3. So which function would this call? Well, I think we can all see and understand that this would call the second average function because it does in fact have 3 parameters and I passed it 3 values. What would happen if I tried to add in a sixth value? I think you can see and understand that it gives me an error because there isn't an average function with 4 parameters, so it's just not going to work. Okay. So let's go back and try to call the other two functions. So now if I said 3.0 and I'll say 4.0, which function would this call? I can run it again. You can see it's still printing 3.5 because it's still the same average. But this would call my third average function, the function that has 2 doubles. And if I wanted to do one final demonstration, let me pass it the character 3. So the character 3, and I'm going to pass it the character 5. And if I was to run it, now I think it should print 4. So there it is. You can see it's printing 4. And it's important to know that this is what the character 4, not the integer 4, although it looks just the same in our console. So those are our 3 special functions. Again, we have functions without parameters, where we simply do not pass any values, void functions, where we do not return anything, and then perhaps the most interesting, overloaded functions. And then I've got to clean up that title, sorry. So that's it. Please send me an email if you have any questions. we have our project that we're going to work on, which is called Robots. I'll try to get some instructions up for that project as well. I hope that you're all doing well, staying healthy, and perhaps enjoying some time with your family at home. I'll talk to you all soon.